The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his iconic red tunic for what he thought would be another routine day of ceremonial duty. At 28 years old, Mitchell had served in the Grenadier Guards for 6 years, completing 2 tours in Afghanistan before being selected for the prestigious role of Queen's Guard. The weight of his bearskin hat felt familiar now, though tourists still stopped and stared at the seemingly motionless figure standing at attention. Mitchell's training had prepared him for many scenarios, from terrorist threats to unruly visitors attempting to climb the palace gates. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly a peaceful Saturday afternoon could spiral into chaos. The date was September 15, 2019, and London was buzzing with the energy of thousands of protesters who had gathered for various causes throughout the city. Climate change activists, political demonstrators, and counter-protesters had been moving through central London since dawn, their chants echoing off the ancient buildings. Standing at his post near the Victoria Memorial, Mitchell maintained his stoic expression while his trained eyes constantly scanned the growing crowd of tourists and onlookers. His rifle, though primarily ceremonial in appearance, was fully functional, and his years of combat experience had taught him to remain alert even during the most mundane assignments. The Metropolitan Police had increased their presence around royal residences that day, with several officers positioned strategically throughout the area. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen had been monitoring the various protest groups through CCTV feeds from the Central Command Center. She noticed that one particular group of about 20 individuals had broken away from the main climate protest and was moving deliberately toward the palace. Their behavior was different from typical tourists or peaceful demonstrators. They moved with purpose, communicating through hand signals, and several appeared to be carrying objects concealed beneath their jackets. Chen immediately radioed the information to the ground units, including the alert to palace security. The group she was tracking consisted of individuals who had been flagged earlier in the day for aggressive behavior during the protests. Intelligence reports suggested they were affiliated with an extremist faction that had been planning disruptive actions for weeks. Their social media posts had contained veiled threats about making a statement that couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, Mitchell noticed the subtle change in atmosphere around his position. The usual flow of tourists taking selfies and asking guards questions had given way to a more tense energy. A group of 4 men in their early 20s had positioned themselves near the palace railings, pretending to be interested in the architecture while clearly studying the security arrangements. Their clothes were slightly disheveled, suggesting they had been in some kind of altercation earlier, and Mitchell could see dried blood on the knuckles of one individual. The 4 men were actually brothers from a working-class neighborhood in South London: Marcus, Tony, Derek, and Kevin Sullivan. They had grown up in poverty, watching their father struggle with unemployment after factory closures devastated their community. Years of frustration with government policies and what they perceived as the disconnect between royal wealth and common people's struggles had radicalized them. They had joined the protest that morning with legitimate grievances, but as the day progressed and tensions escalated, their anger had transformed into something more dangerous. Marcus, the eldest at 26, had served briefly in the army before being discharged for disciplinary issues. He convinced his younger brothers that they needed to make a bold statement that would force people to pay attention to their message. Their plan was simple but reckless: confront a royal guard directly, create a scene that would be captured on dozens of phones, and use the resulting media attention to highlight their political grievances. As the afternoon wore on, Mitchell became increasingly aware of the 4 men's presence. They had been circling his position for nearly an hour, occasionally approaching other tourists but always returning their attention to him. His military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being was telling him that these individuals posed a threat. However, his orders were clear: maintain his position and composure unless directly threatened. The crowd around the palace had grown significantly larger as news of the various protests spread across social media. Street performers, vendors, and curious onlookers mixed with the more politically motivated groups, creating a chaotic atmosphere that made it difficult for security personnel to distinguish between harmless tourists and potential threats. The noise level had increased dramatically, with chanting, music, and the general buzz of hundreds of conversations creating an almost festival-like atmosphere. Detective Inspector Chen had lost visual contact with the four men she had been tracking through the CCTV system. The crowd density made it nearly impossible to follow specific individuals, and several of her cameras had been obscured by banners and signs held by protesters. She dispatched additional plainclothes officers to the area, but in the sea of faces and the constantly shifting crowd, locating four specific individuals proved challenging. Mitchell's radio crackled with routine security updates, but nothing suggested immediate danger. The palace security team was monitoring several groups of interest, but the four brothers had not yet been identified as a specific threat. They had been careful to avoid any overtly suspicious behavior, blending in with other protesters and tourists while they finalized their plan. The psychological pressure of standing motionless for hours while remaining hyper-alert was something Mitchell had learned to manage during his training. However, the growing sense of unease he felt was different from the usual mental fatigue of ceremonial duty. His peripheral vision caught glimpses of the four men repeatedly positioning themselves at different angles around his post, as if testing sight lines or looking for blind spots in security coverage. At approximately 3:47 p.m., the brothers made their final preparations. Marcus had convinced the others that their action would be filmed by dozens of bystanders and would quickly go viral on social media platforms. They believed their message about social inequality and royal privilege would resonate with millions of people who shared their frustrations. What they failed to consider was the immediate and overwhelming response their actions would trigger. The stage was set for a confrontation that would last only 30 seconds but would have consequences, extending far beyond that brief moment. Mitchell continued his duty, unaware that his years of training, both ceremonial and combat, were about to be put to the ultimate test in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras. The four brothers took their positions, convinced that their moment of rebellion would change everything. While security forces throughout central London continued their vigilant watch, not yet realizing that the threat they had been monitoring was about to materialize in the most public way possible. The first sign of trouble came when Marcus Sullivan stepped forward from the crowd, his movement deliberately aggressive as he approached Mitchell's position. The trained guard immediately recognized the body language of someone preparing for confrontation. Marcus's shoulders were tensed, his fists clenched, and his eyes held the wild look of someone who had worked himself into an emotional frenzy. Behind him, his three brothers began to spread out, creating what military tacticians would recognize as a basic flanking formation. Mitchell's training kicked in automatically. While maintaining his ceremonial posture, he subtly shifted his weight to his back foot, preparing for potential defensive action. His hands remained in the proper position on his rifle, but his grip tightened imperceptibly. Years of combat experience in Afghanistan had taught him to read situations quickly, and every instinct screamed that violence was imminent. However, his orders were clear. He could not abandon his post or take aggressive action unless directly attacked. The crowd around them began to sense the tension. Tourists who had been taking photos started to step back, creating a widening circle around the unfolding confrontation. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something newsworthy was about to happen. Others moved their children away from the area, responding to an instinctive understanding that the situation was becoming dangerous. The cheerful atmosphere of a typical tourist day was rapidly transforming into something much more ominous. Marcus stopped just 3 feet from Mitchell, well within the guard's personal space, and began shouting about royal privilege and government corruption. His words were laced with profanity and delivered with increasing volume and aggression. Spittle flew from his mouth as he screamed about how the monarchy represented everything wrong with British society, how working people suffered while royals lived in luxury, and how guards like Mitchell were nothing more than toy soldiers protecting an outdated system. Detective Inspector Chen, monitoring the situation through emergency communications, realized that the confrontation she had been dreading was finally happening. Her CCTV operators had regained visual contact with the scene and were frantically trying to coordinate with ground units. However, the response protocols for incidents near royal residences were complex, requiring coordination between multiple agencies including the Metropolitan Police, Palace Security, and specialized protection units. Mitchell remained motionless during Marcus's verbal assault, his training in ceremonial protocol serving him well. Royal guards were taught to ignore provocations, maintain their dignity, and never engage with hostile members of the public. However, his military experience told him that verbal aggression often preceded physical violence, and he began preparing mentally for what might come next. His peripheral vision tracked the positions of the other three brothers, noting how they had positioned themselves to block potential escape routes. The situation escalated dramatically when Tony Sullivan, the second brother, suddenly lunged forward and shoved Mitchell hard in the chest. The force of the unexpected attack knocked the guard slightly off balance, but his years of training allowed him to recover quickly without falling. The crowd gasped collectively as the line between verbal harassment and physical assault was crossed. Several tourists began backing away more rapidly, while others pressed forward, drawn by the spectacle unfolding before them. Mitchell's response was immediate and professional. He took one step backward to create distance, brought his rifle to a defensive position across his chest, and shouted a clear warning for the attackers to stand back. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command situations, cutting through the noise of the crowd and establishing his determination to defend himself if necessary. However, the brothers were too committed to their course of action to be deterred by warnings. Derek Sullivan, emboldened by his brother's action and caught up in the momentum of the moment, grabbed for Mitchell's rifle. This was exactly the kind of scenario that had been drilled into every guard during training. An attempt to seize a weapon from a royal guard constituted a direct threat not only to the individual soldier, but potentially to national security. Mitchell's response was swift and decisive, using his superior training to maintain control of his weapon while simultaneously calling for backup through his radio system. The physical struggle attracted the attention of nearby Metropolitan Police officers, but the crowd and distance meant that immediate assistance was still precious seconds away. Mitchell found himself engaged in a desperate tug-of-war with Derek, while Marcus and Tony closed in from either side. Kevin Sullivan, the youngest brother, seemed to hesitate for a moment, perhaps realizing that their protest had escalated far beyond what they had originally planned. Amateur video footage captured by tourists would later show the exact moment when the confrontation became a full-scale assault. Marcus struck Mitchell in the side of the head with his fist, while Derek continued trying to wrestle the rifle away. Tony grabbed the guard's ceremonial sword, attempting to pull it from its scabbard. The coordinated nature of their attack suggested some level of planning, though their execution was chaotic and amateurish compared to the professional response they were about to face. Mitchell's years of combat experience in Afghanistan proved invaluable during these crucial seconds. Despite being outnumbered and surprised, he managed to maintain control of his primary weapon while fighting off multiple attackers. His training in close-quarters combat allowed him to use defensive techniques that minimized damage while preventing the brothers from gaining access to his weapons. However, the situation was rapidly becoming untenable for a single defender. The palace security alarm system activated automatically when Mitchell's emergency signal was transmitted. This triggered a cascade of responses throughout the Royal Protection Network. Armed officers positioned at strategic points around the palace began moving toward the incident, while the Central Command Center coordinated with Metropolitan Police units in the area. The response protocols developed after years of security assessments were being put to their ultimate test. In the command center, Detective Inspector Chen watched in real time as the situation deteriorated. She could see Mitchell struggling against the four attackers, while crowds of tourists either fled the scene or pressed closer to capture video footage. Her radio traffic became intense as she coordinated multiple response units, each with different capabilities and jurisdictions. The complexity of protecting royal residences meant that several layers of security had to be activated simultaneously. The brothers themselves were shocked by the intensity of Mitchell's resistance. They had expected the ceremonial guard to be more of a symbolic figure than a trained soldier. Marcus's military background should have prepared him for this possibility, but anger and adrenaline had clouded his judgment. As the struggle continued, it became clear that their simple plan to make a political statement was spiraling into a situation with potentially serious legal consequences. Kevin Sullivan made the decision to join his brothers in the attack, tipping the balance further against Mitchell. The young guard now faced four determined attackers in close quarters, while maintaining his responsibility to protect his weapons and position. The sound of the struggle, combined with shouting from the crowd and the general chaos of the scene, created an acoustic backdrop that would be remembered by witnesses for years to come. The entire confrontation, from Marcus's first aggressive approach to the moment when all four brothers were actively engaged in the assault, had lasted less than 15 seconds. However, those seconds felt like an eternity to Mitchell, who was using every ounce of his training and experience to survive until help arrived. Unknown to the attackers, that help was already racing toward them from multiple directions, armed and prepared to use whatever force necessary to protect the guard and end the threat. The thunderous sound of military boots on pavement cut through the chaos as the first wave of armed support arrived at the scene. 3 members of the Specialist Firearms Unit, who had been positioned just 200 meters away as part of the enhanced security arrangements for the day, reached Mitchell's position in record time. Their black tactical gear and automatic weapons created an immediate and dramatic shift in the dynamics of the confrontation. Sergeant Major William Hayes led the response team, his 22 years of military experience including service in Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan. As he rounded the corner and saw Mitchell struggling with 4 attackers, his training took over completely. Hayes shouted a single authoritative command that carried across the entire area. "Armed police! Get on the ground now." The force and clarity of his voice caused several tourists to immediately drop to the pavement, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something far more serious than a simple altercation. The Sullivan brothers' reaction to the arrival of armed officers was a mixture of shock, panic, and stubborn defiance. Marcus, still caught up in the adrenaline of the moment, made the critical error of continuing to grapple with Mitchell, even as automatic weapons were being aimed in his direction. His military background should have taught him to recognize when a situation had become hopeless, but years of built-up anger and frustration had clouded his judgment beyond reason. Detective Inspector Chen watched the deployment through multiple camera angles, coordinating the response while simultaneously ensuring that innocent bystanders were protected. The area around Buckingham Palace had been equipped with some of the most sophisticated surveillance equipment in London, allowing her to track the movement of both the response teams and the fleeing crowd. Her priority was ending the threat to Mitchell while minimizing risk to the hundreds of tourists who were now running in all directions. The second phase of the security response involved the arrival of additional Metropolitan Police units, including officers with riot shields and non-lethal weapons. The complexity of the situation required multiple types of intervention capabilities, from immediate tactical response to crowd control and evidence preservation. Within 90 seconds of Mitchell's initial distress call, more than 20 law enforcement officers had converged on the scene from various directions. Tony Sullivan was the first of the brothers to recognize the futility of their situation. When he saw the assault rifles pointed at him by professional soldiers, his survival instincts finally overcame his political anger. He released his grip on Mitchell's sword and raised his hands, stepping backward with his palms visible. His action created a brief moment of confusion among his brothers, who were still committed to their original plan despite the dramatically changed circumstances. Mitchell, despite being bloodied and exhausted from the struggle, maintained his professionalism throughout the intervention. Even as armed support surrounded the attackers, he continued to protect his weapon and follow proper protocols. His years of ceremonial training had taught him that royal guards represented something larger than themselves, and maintaining dignity even under assault was part of that responsibility. Blood trickled from a cut above his left eye, and his ornate uniform had been torn in several places, but he remained standing at attention. The crowd's reaction to the armed response was chaotic and varied. Some tourists continued filming with their phones, documenting what they recognized as a historic incident. Others fled the area as quickly as possible, unwilling to risk being caught in potential crossfire. A few individuals attempted to move closer to get better photographs, forcing police officers to establish a wider perimeter while dealing with the primary threat. Sergeant Major Hayes positioned his team in a triangular formation around the remaining attackers, ensuring that any potential shots would not endanger civilians or each other. His tactical experience taught him that situations involving multiple suspects near crowds required careful positioning and clear communication. Each member of his team had a specific area of responsibility and rules of engagement that had been drilled into them through hundreds of hours of training. Derek Sullivan made the situation significantly worse by attempting to use Mitchell as a human shield. He wrapped his arm around the guard's throat and pressed himself against Mitchell's back, apparently believing that the armed officers would not risk shooting with their colleague in the line of fire. This tactical error demonstrated his complete misunderstanding of how trained security forces operate when protecting high-value targets and national security assets. The response to Derek's desperate gambit was swift and overwhelming. 2 additional teams of armed officers arrived from different angles, creating a complex crossfire scenario that eliminated any tactical advantage he might have imagined. Sniper teams positioned on nearby buildings had also acquired visual contact with the scene, though the presence of the guard complicated any potential long-range intervention. Mitchell, finding himself being used as a shield, drew upon his combat experience to remain calm and provide tactical intelligence to the response teams. Despite the arm around his throat restricting his breathing, he managed to communicate through hand signals and brief verbal reports about the weapons and positioning of his attackers. His ability to maintain composure under extreme stress proved invaluable to the officers planning their intervention. Kevin Sullivan, the youngest brother, finally grasped the magnitude of what they had initiated. Seeing his brother Tony surrender and watching Derek's escalation of the situation, he began backing away from the confrontation entirely. However, his movement triggered additional security protocols as officers assumed he might be attempting to flee, or perhaps reaching for a concealed weapon. 2 officers with riot shields moved to intercept him, cutting off any potential escape route. The psychological pressure on Marcus Sullivan intensified as he realized that their political protest had transformed into a situation that could result in serious injury or death. Military precision surrounded him on all sides, with professional soldiers who had seen actual combat and would not hesitate to use lethal force if necessary. His original anger about social inequality seemed insignificant compared to the immediate reality of multiple automatic weapons pointed at his chest. The entire incident was being broadcast live on several news channels, as media helicopters had been following the various protests throughout London. The footage of a royal guard being assaulted and the subsequent armed response was already spreading across social media platforms, creating a public relations crisis that would require careful management by both the palace and law enforcement agencies. Detective Inspector Chen made the tactical decision to attempt negotiation before escalating to more aggressive intervention methods. Through a megaphone, she began addressing the Sullivan brothers directly, using their names and personal information that intelligence officers had quickly gathered. Her approach was designed to personalize the situation and remind them that they were individuals with families and futures, not just anonymous attackers. The negotiation process was complicated by the presence of hundreds of witnesses and the real-time media coverage. Every word spoken by law enforcement officers was being recorded and would later be analyzed by both legal experts and public opinion. The balance between ending the threat quickly and maintaining public confidence in the proportionality of the response required careful consideration of multiple factors simultaneously. As the standoff continued, additional specialized units arrived on scene, including medical personnel prepared to treat both the guard and any injured attackers, explosive ordnance disposal experts in case the incident involved additional threats, and senior commanders who could authorize more aggressive tactics if negotiation failed. The full weight of Britain's security apparatus was focusing on a small area of pavement in front of one of the world's most famous buildings. The critical moment arrived when Derek Sullivan's grip around Mitchell's throat began to tighten, threatening the guard's ability to breathe. This escalation triggered the final phase of the tactical response, as the threat level shifted from assault to potential homicide. Sergeant Major Hayes made a split-second decision that his team would have to act decisively to prevent serious injury or death to the Royal Guard, regardless of the complex positioning and crowd dynamics. The rescue operation required precise coordination between multiple tactical elements. 2 officers with riot shields approached from Derek's blind spots while a third team member prepared a non-lethal intervention using a taser. The key was to disable Derek's ability to harm Mitchell without escalating the situation to lethal force, which would have created additional complications given the media attention and political sensitivities surrounding the incident. Marcus Sullivan, witnessing his brother's increasingly desperate actions, finally seemed to grasp the full implications of what they had started. His own military experience told him that professional soldiers in this situation would prioritize the safety of their colleague above all other considerations, including the welfare of the attackers. The look in Sergeant Major Hayes's eyes was one that Marcus recognized from his own combat deployments, the cold calculation of someone prepared to kill if necessary. The breakthrough came when Kevin Sullivan, overwhelmed by fear and guilt, broke down completely and began shouting for his brothers to surrender. His emotional collapse created a moment of distraction that the tactical team immediately exploited. Officer Rebecca Thornton, approaching from Derek's left side with her riot shield, managed to get close enough to strike his arm with a precision blow that loosened his grip around Mitchell's throat. Mitchell, feeling the pressure on his windpipe decrease, used his combat training to execute a defensive maneuver that broke free from Derek's weakened hold. His years of hand-to-hand combat instruction had included specific techniques for escaping from rear chokeholds, and despite his exhaustion and injuries, muscle memory took over. The successful escape removed the human shield element from the tactical equation, allowing the response teams to engage more aggressively. Derek's reaction to losing his hostage was pure panic. He stumbled backward, looking wildly around at the armed officers who now had clear shots at him from multiple angles. His hands went up in an automatic surrender gesture, but the damage to the situation had already been done. The assault on a royal guard, the attempt to seize weapons, and the use of hostage tactics had elevated the incident far beyond a simple protest or political demonstration. The arrest procedures that followed were swift and professional, with each brother being secured by specialized teams trained in handling high-risk subjects. Marcus offered some resistance, requiring 3 officers to subdue him completely, while Tony and Kevin surrendered more quietly. Derek continued to struggle even after being handcuffed, apparently still not fully comprehending how drastically their situation had deteriorated. Detective Inspector Chen coordinated the evidence preservation process, while medical personnel attended to Mitchell's injuries. The guard had sustained a black eye, several cuts on his face and hands, and bruising around his throat from Derek's chokehold. However, his protective gear and physical conditioning had prevented more serious trauma. The medical team was particularly concerned about potential concussion symptoms given the blow to his head. During the initial assault, the crowd that had witnessed the entire incident presented both challenges and opportunities for the investigation. Hundreds of people had recorded various portions of the confrontation and arrest, providing an unprecedented amount of video evidence from multiple angles. However, managing the crowd and ensuring their safety during the tactical operation had required significant resources and complicated. The response media helicopters circling overhead captured aerial footage that would later be analyzed frame by security experts and legal professionals. The incident had been broadcast live on several news channels, creating immediate public awareness and discussion about royal security protocols, protest rights, and the appropriate use of force by law enforcement agencies. The Sullivan brothers were transported to separate detention facilities for processing and interrogation. The charges they would face included assault on a police officer, attempted theft of government weapons, public disorder, and potentially terrorism-related offenses depending on how prosecutors interpreted their coordinated attack on a royal guard. Their original political motivations would become largely irrelevant in the face of the serious criminal charges. Mitchell was taken to a secure medical facility for thorough examination and treatment. Despite his injuries, he insisted on providing a complete debriefing to security officials before receiving medical care. His professional conduct throughout the incident, from the initial confrontation through the tactical rescue, would later be recognized with commendations from both his military superiors and the royal household. The immediate aftermath of the incident required careful coordination between multiple agencies to manage both the security implications and the public relations aspects. The fact that an assault on royal protection had been captured on live television and witnessed by hundreds of tourists created unprecedented challenges for the palace. Communications team and law enforcement public information officers. Security analysts began an immediate review of the protocols and procedures that had been followed during the incident. While the response had been successful in protecting the guard and apprehending the attackers, questions arose about whether the initial threat had been properly assessed and whether earlier intervention might have prevented the assault from occurring at all. The investigation into the Sullivan brothers' backgrounds revealed a complex picture of economic hardship, political radicalization, and family dysfunction that helped explain their motivations without excusing their actions. Marcus's military service record showed disciplinary problems and early discharge, while his younger brothers had histories of unemployment and minor criminal offenses. Detective Inspector Chen found herself at the center of a major incident review process that would examine every aspect of the response from initial threat assessment through final arrest procedures. The success of the operation in terms of protecting the guard and apprehending the suspects had to be balanced against questions about crowd control, media management, and the appropriate level of force used during the intervention. The political implications of the incident extended far beyond the immediate criminal case. Questions were raised in Parliament about royal security arrangements, the adequacy of protest policing, and the broader issues of social inequality that had motivated the Sullivan brothers' original demonstration. The incident became a focal point for debates about multiple aspects of British society and governance. Medical reports on Mitchell's condition showed that while his injuries were not life-threatening, the psychological impact of being assaulted while performing ceremonial duties would require ongoing support and counseling. The unique nature of Royal Guard service, which combines military professionalism with public ceremonial functions, created special considerations for his recovery and potential return to duty. The legal proceedings that would follow promised to be complex and closely watched by both legal experts and the general public. The intersection of criminal law, national security concerns, and political protest rights created a case that would likely set important precedents for how similar incidents might be handled in the future. As news of the incident spread internationally, it became a symbol of broader tensions within British society about inequality, tradition, and the role of monarchy in modern democracy. The Sullivan brothers had succeeded in creating the media attention they sought, but in a context that would likely undermine rather than advance their original political message. The interrogation rooms at Scotland Yard became the setting for intensive questioning sessions that would determine the full scope of the conspiracy behind the attack. Detective Chief Inspector Michael Crawford, a veteran investigator with extensive experience in terrorism and political violence cases, led the interviews with each of the Sullivan brothers. The authorities needed to determine whether this had been a spontaneous act of protest that escalated out of control or part of a larger planned attack on royal security. Marcus Sullivan, as the eldest and apparent leader of the group, faced the most intensive questioning. His military background made him a particular concern for investigators, who needed to understand how someone with combat training and knowledge of security protocols had planned and executed an assault on royal protection. The interview revealed a complex picture of a man whose legitimate grievances about social inequality had been twisted into dangerous extremism. Through years of unemployment and social isolation, the investigation expanded beyond the four brothers when digital forensics teams examined their phones, computers, and social media accounts. What they discovered was a disturbing pattern of increasing radicalization over several months, with the brothers consuming extremist content that portrayed the monarchy as a symbol of oppression and royal guards as legitimate targets for political action. Their online activities showed connections to several anti-monarchy groups. Though none of these organizations had explicitly endorsed violence, Tony Sullivan's interrogation revealed that he had been the most reluctant participant in the attack, pressured by his older brother to join what was originally described as a peaceful protest action. His account provided crucial details about the planning process, including discussions the brothers had held about making a statement that couldn't be ignored, and their belief that attacking a ceremonial guard would generate massive media attention without serious legal consequences. Derek Sullivan, who had attempted to use Mitchell as a human shield, faced the most serious charges and the most aggressive questioning. His actions had elevated the incident from simple assault to a potential hostage situation with terrorism implications. Investigators discovered that Derek had been researching royal security procedures online for weeks before the attack, suggesting a level of premeditation that contradicted his brother's claims of spontaneous political expression. Kevin Sullivan, the youngest brother, became the key witness for the prosecution when his legal counsel negotiated a cooperation agreement in exchange for reduced charges. His detailed account of the planning sessions, the group's political motivations, and the specific roles each brother was supposed to play provided investigators with a comprehensive understanding of how the attack had been conceived and organized. The medical evaluation of Sergeant Mitchell revealed that his injuries, while not permanently disabling, would require several weeks of recovery time. More significantly, the psychological assessment indicated symptoms of post-traumatic stress related to the assault, particularly the moment when he had been used as a human shield. The Royal Military Police arranged for specialized counseling services designed for soldiers who had experienced combat-related trauma. Media coverage of the incident continued to intensify as more details about the Sullivan brothers' backgrounds and motivations became public. News organizations struggled to balance reporting on legitimate social issues that had contributed to the brothers' radicalization with the need to avoid glorifying or encouraging similar attacks. The incident became a case study in how social media and online extremism could transform political grievances into violent action. The legal proceedings began with preliminary hearings to determine the specific charges each brother would face. Marcus and Derek were charged with multiple felonies, including assault on a police officer, attempted theft of government weapons, and conspiracy to commit terrorism. Tony and Kevin faced lesser charges due to their reduced roles in cooperation with investigators, though all four brothers were denied bail due to the serious nature of their crimes. Security reviews conducted by multiple agencies identified several areas where protocols and procedures could be improved to prevent similar incidents. The main conclusions focused on enhanced threat assessment capabilities, improved coordination between different security agencies, and better crowd control measures during high-risk periods when large protests were occurring near royal residences. The incident prompted significant changes to Royal Guard duties and training programs. New protocols were established for dealing with multiple attackers. Enhanced communication systems were installed to ensure faster response times, and additional security personnel were assigned to provide closer backup support for ceremonial guards. The traditional image of solitary guards standing alone was quietly modified to include more discreet protection measures. Detective Inspector Chen received recognition for her coordination of the multi-agency response, though the incident review also identified areas where earlier intervention might have prevented the assault entirely. The balance between maintaining normal public access to royal sites and ensuring adequate security became a central focus of ongoing policy discussions within law, enforcement, and palace security organizations. The international implications of the attack extended beyond Britain's borders as other nations with ceremonial guard units and royal families examined their own security arrangements. Intelligence agencies shared information about the online radicalization patterns that had contributed to the Sullivan brothers' progression from legitimate political grievance to violent extremism, leading to enhanced monitoring of similar groups in multiple countries. Psychological profiles of the brothers revealed different motivations and levels of commitment to their extremist ideology. Marcus appeared to be a true believer who saw violence as a legitimate political tool, while his younger brothers had been influenced by family loyalty and economic desperation rather than deep ideological conviction. These distinctions would become important factors in their eventual sentencing. The victim impact. Statements prepared for the legal proceedings included not only Mitchell's account of the physical and psychological trauma he had experienced, but also statements from witnesses who had been traumatized by observing the violence and the armed response. Several tourists, including children, required counseling after witnessing what they thought would be a routine sightseeing experience turned into a life-threatening confrontation. Political responses to the incident varied dramatically across the spectrum, with some politicians calling for increased security measures and others arguing that the underlying social issues that had motivated the brothers needed to be addressed. The incident became a focal point for broader debates about inequality, the role of monarchy in modern society, and the appropriate balance between public access and security at historic sites. The Sullivan family's response to their son's actions included public apologies and cooperation with investigators, though they also raised questions about the social and economic conditions that had contributed to the radicalization process. Their working-class background and history of economic Hardship became part of the broader narrative about how legitimate grievances could be twisted into dangerous extremism through online influence and social isolation. As the legal process continued, new details emerged about the specific planning that had gone into the attack, including reconnaissance visits to the palace area, discussions about which guards might be most vulnerable, and debates about whether to bring weapons or rely on attempting to seize the guards' equipment. The level of premeditation demonstrated by this evidence significantly strengthened the prosecution's case and increased the likelihood of serious prison sentences for all four brothers. The trial of the Sullivan brothers began 6 months after the incident, attracting international media attention and becoming one of the most closely watched court cases in recent British legal history. The Old Bailey courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had followed the case since the dramatic footage first appeared on television screens around the world. Security was unprecedented, with armed officers positioned throughout the building and extensive screening procedures for all attendees. Sergeant James Mitchell took the witness stand as the prosecution's primary victim, his testimony providing a detailed and emotional account of the 30-second assault that had changed his life forever. Despite his military training and combat experience, Mitchell described how the unprovoked attack while performing ceremonial duties had affected him differently than battlefield encounters. The violation of attacking someone in a ceremonial role, representing centuries of British tradition, carried a psychological weight that extended beyond the physical injuries he had sustained. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor Elizabeth Hartwell, presented a methodical case demonstrating how the brothers had planned their attack over several weeks. Digital evidence showed extensive online research into royal security procedures, discussions about the symbolic value of attacking a ceremonial guard, and detailed planning about timing and execution. The prosecution argued that this was not a spontaneous political protest but a premeditated assault on national security symbols. Marcus, Sullivan's defense team, attempted to portray him as a man driven to desperation by economic hardship and social inequality, arguing that his actions, while inexcusable, were the result of legitimate grievances about British society. His military service record was presented as evidence of someone who had served his country honorably before being failed by the system he had defended. However, the prosecution effectively countered this narrative by demonstrating the premeditated nature of the attack and the specific targeting of symbolic representation. The most dramatic testimony came from Derek Sullivan himself, who took the stand against his lawyer's advice to explain his decision to use Mitchell as a human shield. His emotional breakdown during cross-examination, where he admitted that he had been terrified and acted without thinking, provided insight into how quickly the situation had spiraled beyond their original intentions. His testimony revealed the moment when political protest had transformed into desperate criminal behavior. Video evidence played a crucial role throughout the trial, with multiple angles of the incident being analyzed frame by frame to establish the timeline and individual actions of each brother. The footage clearly showed the coordinated nature of their approach, the specific targeting of Mitchell's weapons, and the escalation from verbal harassment to physical assault. Expert witnesses provided analysis of the brothers' tactical approach and the professional response by security forces. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen testified about the intelligence gathering and threat assessment processes that had been in place on the day of the incident. Her testimony revealed how the brothers had been identified as persons of interest earlier in the day, but had not been classified as an immediate threat until they began their direct approach to Mitchell's position. This testimony sparked broader discussions about the challenges of distinguishing between legitimate protesters and potential attackers in crowded public spaces. The defense attorneys for Tony and Kevin Sullivan focused on their clients' minimal roles in the planning process and their attempts to de-escalate the situation once it began. Kevin's obvious distress during the incident and his attempts to convince his brothers to surrender were highlighted as evidence of his reluctance to participate in violence. Tony's quick surrender when armed officers arrived was presented as proof that he had never intended for the situation to become life-threatening. Medical testimony about Mitchell's injuries provided stark evidence of the violence involved in the attack. While his physical injuries had healed within weeks, psychological evaluations revealed ongoing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, particularly related to the vulnerability he had felt while being used as a human shield. The court heard how the incident had affected his ability to perform ceremonial duties and his confidence in public situations. Expert witnesses on extremism and radicalization provided context for understanding how the Sullivan brothers had progressed from legitimate political concerns to violent action. Their testimony revealed patterns of online influence, social isolation, and economic desperation that had contributed to the brothers' radicalization process. This evidence was particularly relevant for understanding the broader implications of the case beyond the specific criminal acts. The sentencing phase of the trial became a platform for broader discussions about justice, social inequality, and the appropriate response to politically motivated violence. Victim impact statements from Mitchell, witnesses, and even tourists who had been traumatized by observing the incident provided powerful testimony about the far-reaching effects of the brothers' actions. The statements revealed how the attack had affected not just the immediate victim but numerous innocent bystanders. Judge Sir Robert Pemberton delivered sentences that reflected both the serious nature of the crimes and the varying levels of culpability among the brothers. Marcus Sullivan received 12 years in prison for his leadership role and his military background that made his actions particularly serious. Derek Sullivan received 10 years for his use of Mitchell as a hostage and his continued resistance during the arrest. Tony and Kevin Sullivan received shorter sentences of 6 and 4 years respectively, reflecting their cooperation with investigators and their lesser roles in the planning process. The aftermath of the trial saw significant changes to security protocols around royal residences and ceremonial duties. New training programs were implemented for royal guards, focusing on threat recognition and response to multiple attackers. Enhanced surveillance systems and quicker response protocols were established to ensure that future incidents could be prevented or resolved more rapidly. The traditional balance between public access and security was carefully recalibrated to address the vulnerabilities exposed by the Sullivan brothers' attack. Sergeant Mitchell eventually returned to ceremonial duties after extensive rehabilitation and retraining, though he was assigned to less exposed positions and provided with enhanced backup support. His experience became part of the training curriculum for new royal guards, ensuring that future generations would be better prepared for similar threats. His courage and professionalism during the incident were formally recognized with several military commendations and a personal acknowledgement from the royal family. The broader social issues that had motivated the Sullivan brothers' original grievances continued to be debated in political and academic circles. Though their violent actions had largely discredited their message, the incident became a case study in how legitimate concerns about inequality and social justice could be undermined by extremist tactics and violence. Social workers and community leaders used the case to illustrate the importance of addressing grievances through legal and peaceful means. The international impact of the incident extended far beyond Britain, as other nations with ceremonial military units and royal families reviewed their own security arrangements and threat assessment procedures. Intelligence sharing about online radicalization patterns was enhanced, and several countries implemented new monitoring systems for individuals who might be influenced by similar extremist ideologies. Years later, the incident remained a defining moment in the ongoing discussion about balancing security with public access to historic and symbolic sites. The 30 seconds of violence had triggered changes that would affect royal protection procedures for generations, while the broader questions about social inequality and political expression continued to challenge British society. The Sullivan brothers had achieved their goal of creating an unforgettable media moment, but at a cost that destroyed their own lives and failed to advance their original political cause.